Good morning. Good to see each of you this morning. If you would go ahead and open your Bibles to the book of 1 Peter. That is the book that we all read through this week and that we studied in Bible class. 1 Peter. I want to start off this morning and share with you that my son-in-law is been interviewing for a job. And from what I understand, he's been called back, like this will be his third interview he's fixing to go to. So it sounds real good. And I asked my wife, I said, well, what's the third interview for? From what she understands, they're going to basically kind of, I guess you'd say, give him a test. Because his position is about problem solving. And so they're going to have some scenarios and like present scenarios to him to see how he would handle it, ahead of time, instead of just dropping him in the grease. And I thought about that. I said, that's pretty smart. That's a good way to hire. You can see the caliber of person you're going to get if you see how they're going to react. But do it in a, not say a sterile environment. And I took that on also in my mind to say that as Christians, we need to look at the Bible the same way. We have a bunch of scenarios, not just the daily living that we should get out of here, but there are some future scenarios coming that you and I need to know how to deal with. And the best way for us to deal with something, or at least properly, is to practice ahead of time. You ever do a fire drill at school? That's the whole purpose. Know what you're going to do if it in fact happens. That's what I want you and I to look at 1 Peter for this morning. In fact, I want to give you a little scenario, if you'll just go with me for a few moments. Imagine with me that you are a part of a country. You're a citizen in this country. This particular country is a world power, well respected around the world. And there's a new leader. The new leader that all of a sudden has come in got there by illegitimate means. Doesn't sound too good. Well, that illegitimate new leader made sure and removed the prior administration by some unlawful acts. And remember, this is your country that you're in, and these are your leaders. And there was all kinds of deceit that drove this person, because they had this huge thirst for power. And so this deceit was driven by that thirst for power. And so once he was in office, he decided the best way to gain popularity would be to give and to promise to give lots of things to lots of people so that he could get popular with them. And then he sought also to be remembered as a great builder of many things. He wanted to be known as the builder of the right kind of a country. So what better way to do it than to tear down the existing one and then rebuild it and get credit for building that country? This is not the right kind of a leader, is it? Can you imagine being in that kind of a country? I mean, even that idea of tearing down something just so that he can rebuild it, this particular leader, he even wrote the treasury trying to rebuild what he had torn down. The arrogance, walking on the people. What do you think about that? Would you respond to that kind of a leader in any certain way? How would you respond to a leader in that kind of a way? This is the fire drill. What kind of a leader would do that sort of a thing? What kind of a heathen would it take? Have you ever heard of a leader like that? Or a supposed leader, I should say. Well, the worst is yet about this leader I'll share with you now, because this is not a hypothetical situation anymore. This is a true story that I'm sharing with you. Everything up to now is a true story. This same leader had his claim to fame by blaming the destruction of the very heart of his country on some of its own citizens, Christians in fact. He killed these Christians in many ways. A couple of the ways which he killed these Christians were he would take them out, and sometimes they would take animal skins and drape them over the Christians, and then turn loose the dogs so that the dogs would attack them and maim them to death. And if that wasn't worse or bad enough, Some Christians he would take out to his garden when he'd have these garden parties at night, and he would literally light their bodies on fire and let that cast light into the garden for the party that was going on. It happened. The leader that I'm referring to is Nero, the emperor of Rome. In fact, he met his own demise at the age of 30, almost kind of a poetic justice by suicide. You know, what a terrible kind of leader this guy was. So once again, what would you have done if you were in that country? If that was your leader? If that's how he came to power and that's how he treated the people, how would you react? Well, we don't have to wonder how we're supposed to react, because the context of 1 Peter, that's what those people were going through. This is not a story about what they could have been going through. No, that was what they were going through. They were persecuted, and that's the kind of persecution they were going through. And Peter knew that they needed some instruction. And so when we read through this, I want each of us to really step back and take just a moment and realize this is not just a Bible lesson. This is a drill for something that could happen. We just don't know. How would we respond if we were in the same kind of shoes as these people were? Turn with me to chapter 2 of 1 Peter. We're going to read verses 11 through 17. It says, "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lust which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the king." Peter reminds them that they're pilgrims, they're aliens, they're strangers in this country. And even call them sojourners. Temporary residents is what the word really means. And so he's telling them that while they were temporarily in this land as children of God, because these are Christians he's referring to, he's saying that you need to live good, obedient, submissive lives amongst the people around you. Because don't forget, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. So in other words, they're citizens of the land, but he reminds them that they are also citizens of the heavenly land. So you might say they have dual citizenship. And that's the title of our lesson this morning, is dual citizenship, because that's what these people in 1 Peter had. And we can look at that very quickly and say, well, he's telling them that they're not citizens because they're pilgrims. Well, that's really not so. And we can have that clarified really by Paul. Paul in Acts 22, verses 25 through 27, when he was about to be flogged for some of the preaching of the gospel, he stopped him. He said, "Hey, how is it that you flog a Roman citizen?" Well, soldiers dropped what they were doing. They said, "Whoa, what, you're a Roman citizen?" So that was a big deal. You might say Paul flaunted his citizenship. So there's nothing wrong with being a proud citizen of a country. In fact, I think Paul's example lets us know that that's the right thing to do, to be a proud citizen of the country in which you live. But at the same time, we go to Philippians chapter 3 and verse 20, and he says our citizenship's in heaven. So which is it? Is that contradictory? No. We're to be proud citizens of our country, but even prouder citizens of the heavenly country. Because being part of that country, if you will, being citizens of the heavenly land, that's the one that should drive what we do, even more so than the country in which we live. So, how is a citizen to react? If we have dual citizenship, one foot on the earth and one foot in heaven, you might say, how are we supposed to react to governments? Once again, I'll remind you of the context of the whole deal. These people were living under Nero with those violent killings, the illegitimate way that he even got into office, all of these terrible things. They had no rights. They couldn't even speak about Jesus without fear of being burned. And so that's the context that we're in. How is a citizen to react? He's saying, okay, you Christians, Peter's saying this is how you're supposed to react in this circumstance that you're in today. Look at verses 13 and 14. He says, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. What's it mean to subject ourselves? To be subjected to someone else is, or we subject ourselves, we place ourselves under the subjection of someone else. In other words, that's voluntary. Nobody forces you into subjection, or shouldn't. You should voluntarily do it. At least he's saying that's what Christians do. We're to subject ourselves to every ordinance of man. And we see that in several places throughout the book. In chapter 2 and verse 18, we see the subjection of slaves to masters, the subjection of wives to husbands in chapter 3 and verse 1, and the subjection of younger people to older people in chapter 5 and verse 5. So subjection is a theme throughout the book. It's all through it. And so when he says to be submissive or to submit to every ordinance of man, we need to understand that when it says ordinance, it's not just talking about a law, like we pass a city ordinance. It's talking about creation. The Greek word actually means creation, like more the office that creates laws, not particular laws. So he's saying we are to submit to every office that is created by man in government. Okay? And so it doesn't matter. There's nothing here saying what kind of government we're to submit to, because it covers all of them. Whether it's the democracy, monarchy, a totalitarian government, it doesn't matter. It's whatever you can imagine. If there's a king, then that's the one that you're supposed to pay attention to and be subject to. And Paul taught that same principle in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. If you would turn there with me, because I want to read that. Paul's got a lot of good words to say. Romans 13, 1 through 7. And I think you'll agree that it dovetails in to the words of Peter. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be afraid or unafraid of authority? Then do what is good, and you'll have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good, but if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore, verse 7, to all their due. Taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. Would you agree that the Christian is to show submission to the government that is over them? I hope you do, because that's what Peter and Paul both tell us to do. We are to be subject to the governing authorities. We show that by submission and paying taxes and following the laws, whatever they are, even if we don't like them. Our responsibility as ones with dual citizenship is to submit. But that's not always easy, is it? Especially if there are laws that come down that we don't agree with. And maybe even that we know are not right. That doesn't change the fact of what Peter tells us. we are to submit. But Peter and Paul both give us some motivation. So let's look at a couple of reasons why we need to submit. Well, we find it right there in the text in verses 15 through 17. Very simply put, he says, for this is the will of God. You get that? For this is the will of God, that you submit. That by doing good you may put to silence. That's what doing good is referring to there, submitting. That you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants for God. So what's he mean by putting to silence the ignorance of foolish men? There's always going to be somebody that accuses you of wrongdoing, even when you're doing right. See, that's what those Christians were going through. They were accused of wanting to have another king and not submit, when actually all they were doing is recognizing the heavenly king. And so we need to understand that there's always going to be ignorant, foolish men that accuse us of wrongdoing, even when we do right. But the point is, don't give them a reason. What do I mean by that? Verse 16 says, we're free, or as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice. In other words, one example could be, I'm not going to pay my taxes because I know that a lot of my tax dollars are going to pay for abortion. Just pick whatever your reason is for not paying taxes. You can fool yourself into making a good plan of why you as a Christian ought not pay your taxes. You're giving foolish men a reason to speak evil of you. That's not proving a point. That's giving evil men a good reason to point to Christians to say, look what they're doing. They're lawbreakers. Now is your premise? Okay, sure. I understand the premise. But Peter's saying, regardless of what your premise is, if you don't obey the law, people will use it against the church. Hear that well. He says, first of all, when he makes that reason why we must submit, that this is the will of God. Verse 13, he says it's for the Lord's sake. If he says it's for the will of God, isn't that good enough? You remember when you were a kid? Was I the only household that was ever told because I told you to? Or because I said so? Did y'all ever hear that growing up? You think God thinks any differently? Does God tell you every reason why he's written every verse in this book? No. He doesn't have to. It's because he said so. Why do we need to submit to government? Because he said so. We could stop right there and close the book. But it's not quite that easy, is it? It should be enough. Peter explains why it's the Lord's will. As we mentioned a while ago, it's so we can put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, so that we can't bring a bad name on the church. In Acts chapter 17, verses 5 through 8, Paul and Silas were accused of wanting another king because they were preaching about Jesus. And if you remember, they were thrown into prison. Well, in fact, they went to the house of Jason thinking they were still there. They took Jason to court. But nonetheless, they were after Paul and Silas because they had another king that they were preaching. Verse 17. Look at that last part of verse 17. I've had a real hard time. I'm going to confess right here this morning. I've had a hard time with this whole lesson. So I don't stand before you telling you how I've got this all figured out. My goal is just to share the book and let you take it home with you and think about it. But look at this, verse 17. Honor the king. We know the context. He's not talking about Jesus. Who's he talking about? Nero. Nero. Honor Nero. Why in the world would he say that to such a tyrant as that man? He was inspired by the Holy Spirit, so it's right. They were commanded to honor the king, which at that time was Nero. We read in Romans chapter 13 a while ago that governing authorities exist because they're appointed by God. Paul helps us to understand that. But we can see this even as far back as the Old Testament. You remember the book of Daniel? Chapter 2, about verse 21, we find out that God raises up kings and he takes down kings. Chapter 4 and verse 17, the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will. He says it 2 more times in verse 25 and then also in verse 32. So 3 times in Daniel chapter 4, we get reminders. The Most High rules. He is the one that sets up kings and takes down kings. Regardless of how it looks to you and me, there's a purpose in every one of them. You know of a more evil leader than we find in Exodus chapter 9 verse 16? Pharaoh. Why was he there? Exodus 9 and verse 16 says, but indeed for this purpose I have raised you up, Pharaoh, that I may show my power in you, and that my name may be declared in all of the earth. So you see, he was there for a purpose. Treating God's people wrong, God put him there. God had a purpose that may not make sense to you and me, but that's okay. The fact is, God put him there. So to resist the government is to resist God himself, Romans 13, 2 through 4. And I don't think any of us want to do that. So submitting to government is the same thing as submitting to God. And that will silence the ignorant men. But is there ever a time that we're justified in resisting our government? That's our third point this morning. Is there an exception to the rule? Is there ever a time to resist your government? We've talked about all the reasons we should, but is there ever a time to resist? Well, we need to understand, first of all, that the reason to resist is not just because we don't like the rules. The reason that we don't like if we don't like the law, that's not a good enough reason to disobey it. Because to disobey it is to disobey God. We've established that, I hope, so far. We know that Christians were suffering greatly. We've established that. You can read it in particular in chapter 4, verses 12 through 13 there in 1 Peter. Also chapter 5, verses 8 through 9. There's no doubt they were suffering terribly. In fact, history shows us that Peter himself was crucified. Paul was beheaded. This was all not long after this. This is the same period of oppression that all these folks were going through. Do you think they knew? You reckon they knew something about oppressive governments? You think they're qualified to give us this kind of words? Peter and Paul knew what they were talking about. They were in the middle of it. So under such oppressive governments as Nero, our responsibility would be clear, just like theirs was, to submit. 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 through 2 says, pray for our rulers and for peace. I hope we all do that. It says, therefore I exhort, first of all, that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and for all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. Perhaps if we did that, God would raise up some good kings around the world today. So where's that exception I talked about? I promised you an exception to the rule, right? The only time there's an exception to obeying our government is if the government begs us to not obey God. We have to obey God rather than man. Peter illustrated this, and the other apostles, when they were told not to speak about Jesus. The government told them, do not speak about Jesus. Acts chapter 4, verses 17 through 20. And also Acts 5, verses 14 through 42. You can read about it. And we know that Peter and the others, they were put in prison as a result of their preaching. And when they were there, we know that in the middle of the night, an angel, freedom, opened up the bars. They walked out. What did they do? Did they run for their life and say, thank you, Lord, we got away from that? Nope. They stopped out in the streets and kept preaching. And in fact, we can read there if you'll read those when you get home. You'll read how they sat in the front, Peter in particular, sat in front of that council, and he gave them another U-Haul sermon. Just after coming out of prison. He wasn't scared at all. Now, was he defying the government? Yes. But he was defying an ungodly law, one that demanded that they not preach Jesus. Here's a question for you. Let's say that happened to you and me today in this country. The law comes down, oh, you can still worship. We're not going to totally oppress you, but we still want some votes. But we are going to lay down some law. You can no longer talk about Jesus to others. Would that affect you? Would it just affect you up here, or would it actually change anything you're doing? I don't want to answer that in front of you. I think all of us have to answer that for ourselves. But that's what they were willing to do. They were willing to go to prison and even death just to share the gospel, because they went against the government where they had to. So even if there's a law that we don't like, we can't break another law in protest of it. So because the fact that they had the law saying you can't preach about Jesus, that didn't give them the right to go burn down their buildings in protest to a bad law. You see, that doesn't authorize law breaking. We're Christians. We need to know better than that. And so that's what he's trying to get across to them. And one thing I want us to understand is whenever we're so quick to say, I know what I'd do, I'll tell you what. If I was them, here's what I'd have done. Watch it. Watch it. Really think about that. What if Paul and Silas would have overtaken the guard and never got thrown in prison? Well, I don't know. Neither do you. But I do know a couple of things. I know that an angel would not have come in the middle of the night and freed them. And all those people would have been aware of it. Right? Wouldn't have happened. I know that Gamaliel would not have stood up in the middle of the whole group of those Sadducees that were there and said, hang on, y'all leave these guys alone. Y'all are saying they ought not preach about Jesus. Gamaliel, you remember, he was the logical guy. He said, if there's nothing to what they're doing, as y'all say, then just leave them alone. It'll go away. Like, and he names a couple of guys that tried to get followers in the past, and they died and went away. And he told them, he said, if you leave them alone and there's nothing to it, it'll just go away. But if it keeps on going, then we'll know there's something to it. You see, that never would have happened if they took the law in their own hands and didn't go to prison. You see, what's the lesson in that? The lesson is this. If we take the law into our own hands to defy the government, don't think that you're doing any good. Don't think that you're going to outdo God. God's got a plan. They could have thwarted God's plan, at least that part of it. And we could too, if we approach our government in an improper way. Look at Acts chapter 6 and verse 1. Acts 6 and verse 1. And what you'll find here is a result of submission. Oh, wrong one, sorry. Well, I got the wrong one written down. But nonetheless, submission is a sign of a Christian. If someone claims to be a Christian but does not have submission as part of their daily activities, your claim to be a Christian is false. That's what Peter says, not Damon. So let's pray for our government and submit to it as long as it does not try to teach us or keep us from teaching and worshiping our God. So you and I that have been washed in the blood, we have dual citizenship. We're citizens of heaven, but we're also citizens of America. Proud citizens, and that's okay. So I hope each one of us are going to take just these few scriptures we've covered and think about them. And I don't mean just a little while. Think about them this week. What would you do if you were in the situation that these folks were in? Would you have the intestinal fortitude and the prayer life to follow through like Peter told these Christians to do? Like Peter showed us to do? You have to answer that for yourself. We should thank God daily that we're in a country that does not have that kind of oppression at this time. But we've got to take some time to ponder all the what-if scenarios. What would I do in this situation? It's a serious question, and I'm afraid it's got eternal consequences. This is more than a matter of opinion. This book was dedicated to talking about submission. The Bible, most of it, especially the New Testament, is submission. So we need to think about it thoroughly. But the most important submission that we could ever have in our life is when we submit to the Lord. If you've already submitted in baptism, then you're already a child of God. But maybe you've wandered, and it's time to submit again. To turn your life back over to Him. To quit doing things your own way and do them His way. And if that's what you need this morning, and you want the prayers of the church to help you, that's what we're here for. And so, if you need the prayers of the church or anything else that we can help you with, make it known. Make it known now as we stand and as we sing.